this week, dozens of current and former NYCHA employees were arrested in a massive corruption probe. The U.S. Attorney said they were part of the largest single-day bribery takedown in Justice Department history. Well, now there's a call for more transparency within public housing agencies. Bronx Representative Ritchie Torres introduced his proposed legislation in response to the NYCHA bribery scandal and joins us right now with more. Thank you for joining us.
It's an honor to be here.
Well, appreciate it. So, first of all, why don't you explain exactly what your proposal proposes?
Yeah. So, look, as a product of public housing, I mean, I find it painful that NYCHA is at the center of the largest single-day bribery takedown in DOJ history. You know, one case or a few cases of bribery can be explained away as outliers, but 70 cases of bribery affecting 1/3 of all NYCHA properties points to something systemic. It's a systemic failure of oversight and management at the New York City Housing Authority. It's a culture of corruption. And so I'm introducing legislation that would require NYCHA to be more transparent, that would require the disclosure of all contracts, including micro contracts, no bid contracts, which historically have been shrouded in secrecy, leaving them wide open to abuse, fraud, and corruption.
You know, you started really campaigning against NYCHA and the corruption that goes on there back in 2019 when you were here with the city. The special counsel by the Department of Justice, they had a monitor put on them in 2019 as well. So both the same year. 5 years later, this is still going on. We finally see arrests. How has this continued for 5 years if people knew about it?
Look, back in 2019, when I was on the City Council, I held a hearing sounding the alarm about micro-contracting, which I saw as a breeding ground for corruption and influence peddling. So as a general rule, NYCHA contracts are subject to competitive bidding. The exception to the rule is micro-contracts, which are exempt from competitive bidding.
Which are contracts below $10,000.
Below $10,000. And so a superintendent in NYCHA can easily structure a micro-contract below $10,000 to escape competitive bidding requirements and then steer those contracts toward family, friends, and preferred vendors. And so 5 years ago, it was obvious that that was an open invitation to corruption and extortion. And NYCHA admitted back then that it had no system in place for detecting the illegal splitting of contracts and the illegal steering of contracts toward preferred vendors.
So since then, obviously we have these 70 arrests on Tuesday. Your proposal comes out, and you asked NYCHA to give you the improvements they say they've made since then. What has been their response?
There's no response yet, but you know, NYCHA has been responsive and cooperative, but there's no response to the latest letter that I've sent out. Okay,
we have a statement from the spokesperson of NYCHA, Executive Vice President and Chief Communications Officer Barbara Brancaccio, and she says NYCHA has already made substantial reforms to its procurement processes, with the controls implemented since 2021 yielding a nearly 50% reduction in micro-purchase spends on services at the developments. While micro-purchases allow the staff to quickly and flexibly respond to emergencies at the development level, these recent and unfortunate incidents demonstrate the additional oversight that is needed. Obviously, additional oversight is needed. Their argument is, though, without this micro funding process, they wouldn't be able to respond quickly, you know, if a pipe breaks or something like that. Does your legislation affect that?
No, my legislation simply requires greater transparency because sunlight is the best disinfectant. There could be a need for micro-contracting, right? NYCHA needs the flexibility to respond to emergencies, but there should be oversight. There should be some measure of transparency and accountability. You know, a superintendent cannot be free to steer contracts toward friends at the cost of corrupting the New York City Housing Authority.
So what is your process then if an emergency breaks out and they need to respond quickly? They can still do it, just report after?
I think you can continue to have micro-contracts, but there should be greater scrutiny and oversight over those contracts. And NYCHA needs a system in place for detecting the abuse of micro-contracts.
All right, I want to ask you one question just because it was in the news yesterday, and the special counsel concerning President Biden and the looking at the documents, whether or not they decided to have legal charges, they decided not to. But we were talking earlier politically with the charges that he's an elderly man who has memory issues. You're a Democrat. He's the Democratic, looks like going to be the nominee. It'll be a shock if he's not. You look at this, how politically damaging do you think this can be to the president going into a campaign?
Look, I cannot speak to the special counsel's experience, but I've met with the president on several occasions in the White House, and I've often found him engaged, and he often does most of the talking. So I have no doubt that he's actually competent enough to serve as president. And keep in mind that he's had the most productive and most productively bipartisan presidency in recent history. I mean, he passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill, bipartisan scientific research and development bill, a bipartisan gun safety bill, bipartisan veteran health care bill, the boldest climate legislation in American history. So I feel like he should be judged by his record, and his record speaks for itself.